In a small, quiet town nestled between rolling hills, there lived a young man named Daniel. From the outside, his life appeared simple, even dull. He was the kind of person who blended into the background. No grand achievements, no extraordinary talents, just a steady, predictable routine. Yet within him burned an ambition that he couldn't quite put into words. It wasn't about fame or wealth. It was the quiet desire for something more, something greater than the life he had been handed. Every morning, Daniel would wake up early and walk to the bakery where he worked. The smell of fresh bread filled the air as he knelt down to tie his apron, wondering if there was more to life than this. He wasn't unhappy, but the days felt long, like he was stuck in a loop. He had dreams of becoming something different, something more. But those dreams felt so far away, like stars too distant to touch. One quiet evening, after another day that felt like the last, Daniel sat by the window, watching the sun dip below the hills. He had always been the quiet observer, never the one to take risks or step outside the comfortable boundaries he'd set for himself. But on this particular evening, something shifted within him. The question that had always lingered in the back of his mind suddenly rose to the surface. Why? Not me? Why can't I become more than this? And so, that night a decision was made. Daniel couldn't stay in his comfort zone forever. He had to try. It didn't matter how small or insignificant his first step might be. What mattered was that he took it. The following day, he would leave behind the bakery for a while and set out to explore what lay beyond the small town that had been his world. The next morning, Daniel stood at the edge of his small, familiar town. The air was crisp with the scent of early spring, and the roads, though well-trodden, seemed to stretch out in endless possibilities. It felt as though the earth itself was whispering to him, urging him to move forward, to take that first step into the unknown. He had no grand plans or clear direction. All he had was a spark of determination and a deep belief that change was possible. The journey was not easy. The roads he chose were unfamiliar, and the towns he passed through were full of people who seemed to have it all figured out. There were moments of doubt when Daniel felt small, insignificant in the grand scheme of things. The challenges of each new day felt like mountains, and his dreams, though vivid in his mind, seemed like distant peaks he could never reach. But Daniel pushed forward, one step at a time. He learned to embrace the discomfort, knowing that growth was never easy. He found work wherever he could, helping in markets, assisting in fields, doing whatever needed to be done. It wasn't glamorous, but each task added something new to his understanding of the world and of himself. With every new challenge, he grew stronger, more capable, more aware of his own potential. It wasn't long before he began to realize that the discomfort he had once feared was, in fact, a sign of progress. The moments of struggle became less intimidating, and his confidence slowly began to build. He was no longer the quiet observer from his small town. He was someone who was willing to step into the unknown, to face the challenges that life had to offer. As Daniel's journey continued, the days blurred together in a rhythm of small victories and occasional setbacks. He learned the hard way that the world wasn't always kind to dreamers. But the harder he worked, the more he began to understand that persistence was a powerful ally. There were days when he felt as though the weight of the world was bearing down on him, moments when doubt crept in like a shadow, whispering that maybe he wasn't cut out for this after all. But Daniel kept going. He didn't have all the answers, and the path ahead was still unclear. But he learned to take life one moment at a time, focusing on what he could control. He spent hours reading, learning new skills, and pushing the boundaries of what he thought was possible. With each task, whether big or small, he honed his abilities and gained a deeper understanding of his own resilience. It was the small, consistent efforts that were building the foundation for something much greater. On one particularly exhausting day, when Daniel was about to give up and retreat to a life of comfort, he met an old man at a market stall. The man, with a twinkle in his eye, noticed Daniel's frustration and asked him what was wrong. As Daniel poured out his heart, the man listened patiently before offering him a simple piece of advice. The road to success isn't a sprint, it's a marathon. Keep moving forward, no matter how slow you think you're going. Persistence will bring you where you need to be. Those words stuck with Daniel long after their brief conversation ended. He realized that success wasn't measured by how quickly he reached his goal, but by the courage to keep moving forward in the face of adversity. He understood, in that moment, that the only true failure was giving up. As the weeks turned into months, Daniel's perspective began to shift. The discomfort he once dreaded now became a trusted companion. He stopped viewing challenges as obstacles to avoid and started seeing them as opportunities for growth. Each struggle, whether it was a difficult job, an unexpected setback, or a moment of failure, taught him something invaluable. He learned that it was okay to stumble, that mistakes weren't the end of the road, but simply part of the process. Every time he faced a setback, he would pause, reflect, and adjust. The perfectionist in him wanted to fix everything immediately, to rush toward success without the bumps along the way. But he learned that growth wasn't a straight line. It was a winding path, full of unexpected turns and detours. There were days when he felt like he was failing, when the weight of his ambition seemed too heavy to bear. On those days, he would remind himself of all the progress he had made. He remembered the quiet observer he once was, the person who hesitated at every opportunity. Now, he was someone who had dared to dream and, more importantly, dared to act. That alone was something worth celebrating. One evening, as Daniel sat by the fire after a long day, he realized something profound. The struggle wasn't something to fear. It was the very thing that had shaped him into who he was becoming. The journey wasn't about avoiding difficulty, but about learning to embrace it, to grow from it. And as he looked back on his journey, so far he felt a deep sense of gratitude for every hard moment, for every time life had challenged him. Without them, he wouldn't be the person he was today. The more Daniel embraced the struggle, the more he began to see the world in a different light. His days were still filled with hard work, but they no longer felt like burdens. He was no longer focused solely on the destination, but on the journey itself. He learned that true growth wasn't just about reaching a goal, but about transforming along the way. Every day he felt stronger, more capable, and more in tune with the person he was becoming. But even with this newfound sense of peace, there were moments when doubt would creep in. What if all this effort was in vain? What if he was never meant to achieve the things he dreamt of? One rainy evening, as Daniel sat in a small, quiet cafe, he overheard a conversation that would change his perspective forever. Two travelers, older than him and seasoned by years of experience, spoke about their own journeys. They spoke of dreams and failures, of struggles that seemed insurmountable at the time, but which, in hindsight, had been the key to their success. One of them said, "It's not about being the fastest or the smartest. It's about how much you're willing to endure. The moment you decide to keep going, even when everything tells you to stop, that's when everything changes." Those words struck Daniel like a bolt of lightning. He realized that his journey had reached a turning point. It wasn't just about enduring the struggle. It was about finding purpose in it. Each challenge he faced was no longer an obstacle. It was a lesson, a part of his story that was shaping him into someone capable of achieving greatness. That night, as Daniel lay in bed, he knew something profound had shifted within him. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was thriving, embracing every moment of his growth, no matter how difficult. The turning point had come, and there was no turning back. As Daniel continued on his journey, the world around him seemed to open up. Opportunities that had once seemed out of reach now appeared at every turn. But with each new opportunity came a new challenge, the challenge of believing in himself. In the quiet moments when he was alone with his thoughts, the old doubts would still creep in. He wasn't sure if he was ready. He wasn't sure if he was enough. But slowly, Daniel began to understand something crucial. That belief in oneself wasn't about being perfect or having all the answers. It was about trusting the process, trusting that the person he was becoming was capable of handling whatever came his way. He didn't need to have everything figured out. He just needed to keep showing up, keep trying, and trust that every effort was bringing him closer to his dreams. One afternoon, while standing on the edge of a vast, unfamiliar city, Daniel had a moment of clarity. He realized that for most of his life, he had been waiting for permission to be great, waiting for someone to tell him that he was ready. But the truth was, he had always been ready. The only thing standing between him and his dreams was the belief that he was worthy of them. That evening, as he sat in a park watching the sunset, Daniel made a promise to himself. From that day forward, he would trust in his abilities. He would stop waiting for external validation and start believing in his own potential. It wasn't an easy promise to make, but it was the most important one he could ever keep. As time passed, Daniel's life continued to change, but not always in the ways he expected. For every step forward, there seemed to be a setback. Every new challenge came with its own set of frustrations. But Daniel had learned to see these challenges differently. Rather than seeing them as signs that he was failing, he began to view them as tests of his patience. Patience was something Daniel had never been good at. He had always been someone who wanted things to happen quickly. Success, recognition, progress. But the more he pushed for instant results, the more he realized that true success wasn't about speed. It was about endurance. It was about continuing to move forward, even when the end seemed far away. One day, Daniel found himself standing in front of a large, dilapidated building that he had been working on for weeks. The project had taken longer than expected, and his progress had felt slow. The walls he had been building seemed to rise only a little bit each day, and the finish line seemed miles away. Frustration bubbled up inside him. He wanted to be done. He wanted to see the results of his hard work. But then he stopped. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and reminded himself of something he had learned over the past year. Progress didn't always look like progress. Sometimes the smallest steps were the ones that mattered most. It was the consistent effort, the unwavering belief in the process, that would get him to the end. The moment he allowed himself to embrace patience was the moment he realized how much he had already accomplished. He understood that true growth came in its own time. Some things couldn't be rushed, and that, in itself, was okay. As Daniel's journey continued, the challenges he faced grew more complex, and the stakes higher. The tests of patience that had come before seemed like mere warm-ups compared to what was about to unfold. He was no longer just trying to prove himself to the world. He was now faced with questions that went deeper, questions about who he was, what he stood for, and what kind of person he wanted to become. One winter, while traveling through a small village, Daniel met a man named Elias, who owned a humble workshop. Elias had a reputation for his skill, his work ethic, and his deep sense of integrity. One day, after Daniel had worked with Elias on a project for several days, the old man pulled him aside and said something that would resonate with him for years to come. "Success is not just about what you achieve," Elias said, his weathered face serious. "It's about how you achieve it. What's your character when no one's looking? Can you hold on to your values even when the world around you is telling you to do otherwise?" Daniel thought about the words for days. It wasn't the first time he had heard advice about character, but something about Elias's words felt different. They weren't about surface-level success. They were about the deeper, internal qualities that defined who someone truly was. The temptation to take shortcuts, to compromise on integrity, was something Daniel hadn't yet faced. But he knew, deep down, that the day would come when he would have to make that choice. Months later, as Daniel was given the opportunity to work on a major project, that moment came. The offer was lucrative, but it required bending the truth, cutting corners, sacrificing quality for speed. In the past, Daniel might have been tempted by the money and the recognition. But now, after his conversations with Elias and the lessons he had learned along the way, he found himself at a crossroads. It was a test of character, and he was ready for it. He turned down the offer. It was a decision that cost him financially, but it felt like the right one. Daniel realized that his journey was not just about building a successful life. It was about building a life he could be proud of, one that aligned with his values. In that moment, he understood that true success could never come at the expense of integrity. As Daniel continued his journey, he began to understand something that was often overlooked in the pursuit of success: the importance of relationships. For so long, he had been focused on his personal growth, on the path he was carving for himself. But as time went on, he realized that no journey was truly complete without the people who walked beside you. One evening, after completing another project in a distant town, Daniel sat with an old friend he hadn't seen in years. The conversation flowed easily, as it always did with those who truly understood him. They talked about the past, about their shared childhood memories, their early dreams, and the paths that had taken them to where they were now. It was in this conversation that Daniel truly understood the value of those connections. It wasn't just about what they had accomplished individually, but about the strength they gave each other through the years. The people who had supported him, who had believed in him when he had doubts, had played an integral role in shaping the person he had become. As the night wore on, Daniel thought about the people he had met along his journey. The mentors, the friends, the strangers who had crossed his path. They had each left an imprint on his soul, offering wisdom, encouragement, and sometimes even tough love when he needed it most. He began to see that success was not something to be hoarded or achieved alone. It was something to be shared, something that grew when it was nurtured by the relationships around it. It became clear to Daniel that the greatest rewards were not the material gains or the recognition. They were the bonds of trust, friendship, and mutual respect that he had built along the way. His journey was no longer just about him. It was about the people who had helped him, the people he had helped, and the collective growth they had experienced together. As Daniel's journey progressed, he found that the hardest challenges were not always the ones that tested his physical endurance or his work ethic. The most difficult moments were those when he had to let go of old habits, old fears, and even old dreams that no longer served him. It was a strange realization. For so long, Daniel had been holding on tightly to his plans, to his vision of what his life should look like. He had been working towards something, always striving for the next goal, the next achievement. But over time, he began to see that in order to move forward, he needed to make space for something new. There were aspects of his past that were holding him back, like heavy stones in a backpack that had once been useful but now only weighed him down. One day, while walking through a dense forest, Daniel met a wise old woman who had lived in the village for many years. Her face was marked by the years of weather, and her eyes held a quiet understanding. They spoke for a long time about life, about growth, and about the inevitable need for change. When Daniel spoke of the things he felt he couldn't release, fears, regrets, expectations, the old woman listened, nodding slowly. "Growth is like a tree," she said. "It doesn't hold on to its old branches forever. It lets them fall to make way for new ones. And just as the tree grows taller, stronger, and more resilient, so do we when we let go of the things that no longer serve us." That conversation stayed with Daniel long after he left the village. Slowly, he began to let go of the past. He let go of the fear of failure that had once driven him, of the need for constant approval, of the pressures he had placed on himself to be perfect. He began to embrace the uncertainty of the future, trusting that by releasing his grip on what had been, he was making space for what could be. The further Daniel traveled, the more he realized that clarity was not something that could be found through sheer effort alone. It was something that emerged quietly, almost imperceptibly, when he allowed himself to stop and truly listen to the world around him, to the people in his life, and, most importantly, to himself. One evening, while resting by a quiet lake, Daniel sat in stillness, watching the water ripple gently under the soft glow of the setting sun. The air was cool, and the silence enveloped him like a protective cloak. It was here, in this peaceful solitude, that the weight of his journey seemed to lift. For the first time in a long while, he stopped trying to chase something. He stopped trying to force progress. He simply allowed himself to be. It was in that moment of calm that clarity washed over him, not in a sudden burst of insight, but in a quiet realization that he had everything he needed within him. He didn't need to have all the answers, or even know exactly what the future held. What mattered was that he had learned to trust himself, to believe in the strength he had cultivated through his struggles, and to embrace the unknown with courage. In that stillness, Daniel understood that the search for clarity wasn't about finding a specific destination, but about being at peace with the journey itself. The answers would come in their own time, but for now, all he had to do was continue, moving forward, trusting that each step, no matter how small, was leading him closer to his true purpose. As Daniel's journey continued, he began to realize that life was full of choices, and every choice carried with it the weight of uncertainty. Each decision, no matter how seemingly small, had the potential to alter the course of his life in ways he could never predict. In the past, the fear of making the wrong choice had often paralyzed him, keeping him stuck in one place, hesitating at every crossroads. But now, as he grew stronger, he found that the courage to choose, despite the unknown, was a crucial part of his growth. One day he found himself standing before two paths in a dense forest. One path seemed familiar, a route he had walked before, filled with known obstacles and known comforts. The other was uncertain, untraveled, and mysterious. It was the kind of path that could lead to anything, and that terrified him. Daniel stood there for a long time, wrestling with his doubts. What if the unfamiliar path was too difficult? What if he failed, or worse, never found his way back? The pull of the known path was strong, but deep down he felt the stirrings of something greater, the realization that to grow, he had to leave behind the comfort of what was familiar. The decision didn't come all at once. At first, Daniel stood there, unsure of which way to go. But slowly, over time, the choice became clearer. He understood that courage wasn't about certainty. It was about trust. Trust in himself. Trust in the process. Trust that he could handle whatever came his way. So, with a deep breath and a quiet resolve, Daniel chose the unknown path. The moment his foot stepped onto that unfamiliar trail, he felt a rush of excitement and fear, both together. It wasn't the absence of fear that gave him courage. It was the willingness to move forward with it. And as he walked, step by step, he realized that every choice he made, every uncertain decision, was another opportunity to grow, to learn, and to become the person he was meant to be. As Daniel ventured further along the path, he began to realize that the greatest journey he was undertaking was not outward, but inward. The struggles, the choices, the lessons, everything was guiding him toward an understanding that had nothing to do with the world outside. He had spent so much time looking for answers from external sources, but now, in the quiet of the forest, he discovered that the answers had always been within him. There were moments when doubt returned, as it always did. Moments when he questioned whether he had made the right choice, whether he was really on the right path. But during those moments, Daniel started to recognize the subtle voice inside him that reminded him to keep going, to trust that everything unfolding around him was a part of a greater plan. It wasn't always easy to hear that voice above the noise of his fears, but when he allowed himself to pause, to breathe deeply and listen, the inner wisdom became clear. One evening, as Daniel sat by a campfire under the stars, he reflected on all that he had experienced. He had faced so many challenges, some physical, others emotional, but each one had been an opportunity to peel back another layer of himself, to get closer to who he truly was. He no longer saw obstacles as things to be avoided, but as chances to go deeper, to learn more about his own resilience, his own strength. The more Daniel embraced this inward journey, the more he realized that it wasn't the external accomplishments that would define him, but how he faced the trials and joys of life with authenticity, with compassion, and with unwavering faith in his ability to grow. The greatest discoveries he now understood were the ones he made about himself. As Daniel continued on his journey, he encountered moments that tested him in ways he could never have anticipated. His path was not always smooth. There were days when the weight of his decisions felt heavy, when the distance ahead seemed endless. and when the temptation to give up whispered in his ear. Yet, with each setback, Daniel found something deeper, an inner strength that he had never known existed. One cold morning, while traveling through a rugged mountain range, Daniel faced a particularly fierce storm. The wind howled and the snow blew so fiercely that he could barely see the path ahead. For a moment, doubt crept in. Maybe he should turn back. Maybe this journey was too much. But as he stood there in the cold, huddled against the storm, something shifted inside him. He remembered all the moments in his past where he had been tested and how he had overcome them. He remembered the lessons he had learned, the people who had believed in him, and the strength he had built over time. With that memory came a realization. Resilience wasn't about avoiding challenges. It was about continuing despite them. It was about getting up when you fell down, about moving forward when the road ahead seemed impossible. Resilience wasn't something you were born with. It was something you forged in the heat of adversity. So, with renewed determination, Daniel pushed forward into the storm. The wind fought against him, and the cold seemed to seep into his bones, but step by step he moved onward. It wasn't easy and it wasn't fast, but he kept going, and with every step, he grew stronger. By the time the storm cleared, Daniel stood atop the mountain, looking out at the world below. He was exhausted, cold, and bruised, but he had made it. In that moment, he understood something profound. Resilience wasn't about being unbreakable. It was about bending without breaking. It was about being willing to keep going, no matter how difficult the path might seem. As Daniel reached the end of his journey, he looked back on the road he had traveled. What had begun as a quest for success had transformed into something far greater. A journey of self-discovery, of growth, and of deep personal understanding. He had faced obstacles, made choices, endured pain, and found moments of peace. He had learned the hard way that life was not just about reaching a destination, but about embracing the process along the way. The path had never been straight. There had been detours, setbacks, and moments of doubt. But each twist, each turn, had brought him closer to the person he was meant to be. And as he stood now at the edge of the world he had once feared to enter, Daniel realized that the journey was never about finding the perfect outcome. It was about learning to live fully, to face each challenge with courage, and to move forward with the wisdom gained from every experience. In the distance, Daniel saw a familiar figure, Elias, the old man from the village, standing at the foot of a mountain. The path ahead seemed even steeper now, but Daniel knew it was not the mountain itself that mattered. It was the courage to keep climbing, the patience to endure the climb, and the understanding that the summit was always within reach, as long as he didn't stop. With a smile, Daniel walked forward, knowing that the journey would never truly end. Life would always present new challenges, new opportunities for growth, but he was no longer afraid of the unknown. He had learned to embrace it, to trust that each step, no matter how difficult, was a part of his journey. And so, the story continued, not as a search for something outside of himself, but as a celebration of the person he had become, of the lessons learned, and of the endless possibilities that awaited him with every new day.